Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for inviting me to address this question. It is a very important question today. Of course, due to the fact that very recently, the building was reconverted to a mosque. It was a mosque for nearly 400 years before it was turned into a museum by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk um, in the earliest decades of the 20th century, post First World War, and then it remained a museum until now. And now the current government of Turkey has decided to reconvert it into a mosque. So, what is the history of this particular building? This was initially a church built in the 6th century by a Roman emperor, or to be more historically correct, a Byzantine emperor called Justinian II. Justinian II had built this particular structure, which remained the largest indoor structure in the world for over 1,000 years. It was a grand achievement for the time, and it remained so for the next 1,000 years because no other building could match its indoor space. It was the largest dome in the world, put it this way. It was completed in the year 537 CE, almost you can say about 30 to 40 years before the birth of the Prophet of Islam. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born in the year 570, and this building was completed in 537 according to most records. So this was a great achievement on the part of Justinian, and when he walked into the building, the legend goes that he stated with a lot of pride that, Solomon, today I have surpassed thee. In other words, I have beaten Solomon today. He was referring to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And in comparison to that, he had built this giant structure. It remained in Christian hands for a long time, obviously changing hands from denomination to denomination. First, it remained in the hands of the Greek Orthodox Church. Then, for some time in the 13th century, it was controlled by the Catholic Church, and then it was given back to the Orthodox Church. And then until 1453, when Sultan Muhammad II, also known as Muhammad al-Fatih, he had conquered the city of Constantinople and renamed the city Istanbul. And when he conquered the city, having besieged it for nearly 54 days, when he entered the city, he found it absolutely devastated. And when he found this building in the middle of the square, the Sultan Ahmed Square today, he was absolutely fascinated. He was completely blown away by the building, and he decided to convert the building into a mosque at the time. Now, a lot of people are questioning today as to how a museum can be turned into a mosque. In order to understand that, you must understand the history of this particular building. It has been the law, or it has been understood by civilizations, that whenever one civilization overpowers another one, and if it's done by force, if it's a conquest, then whatever belongs to that particular civilization or the vanquished civilization is basically it becomes a possession of the victorious civilization. So in this case, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih in 1453, when he had defeated the Byzantine Empire, whatever remained of it, he basically, because he took the city by force, everything within the city belonged to him. He was the ruler. He decides what happens. So he decided to convert Hagia Sophia into a mosque. And in this way, he actually gave respect to the basilica. He actually wanted to honor this great giant structure by making it a place of worship for Muslims, also as a sign of his victory, as a sign of his power over the Greek Orthodox Church. And one of the best ways he could do that was to turn the basilica or the building into a mosque. Of course, at that time, the Greek Orthodox Church, in inverted commas, was dealing with Rome. The Emperor Constantine, who was reigning in Constantinople at the time was asking for help from the Venetians, from the Pope in Rome. So it was a giant venture. It was a joint, rather. It was a joint venture, which was also a giant venture when we look at the magnitude of the conflict between the Turks or the Muslims at the time and the Christian world or Christendom. So one cannot simply explain the history of Hagia Sophia as a building, as a structure in a short sitting like this. The summary is that when a civilization defeats another civilization, the law that was common between all these civilizations was that whoever becomes victorious basically possesses everything that belonged to the vanquished civilization. And by that virtue, by that system, everything within the city of Constantinople and the larger Byzantine territory, became under the ownership or became a possession of the Sultan of the Turks and the subsequent sultans. So they kept changing the structure. They added minarets to the structure. The minarets didn't exist when Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih took the city. Minarets were built later on to add the Islamic character to the building. And there was a huge statue of Justinian, Emperor Justinian, which was which was put there in the year 543 CE, if I'm not mistaken. And there was some kind of superstition attached to that particular statue, which was right in front of the building of Hagia Sophia. And people believe that so long as the statue stands, nothing will harm the Byzantine Empire. So for that reason, to undo that particular superstition, the Turks, the Muslim Turks, they took down the statue and broke it into pieces. And by the 16th century, the pieces of that particular statue could have been seen lying around in close vicinity of the basilica. So this is a short history. And those people who are, raising their voice and their concerns about this recent decree on the part of Turkish churches, they need to understand the history of this particular building. It was a mosque for 4 centuries before Mustafa Kemal Ataturk decided to make it into a museum. Now the same people democratically decided that they want to turn it back to a mosque. And the majority of people living in the city of Constantinople are Muslims, and it never became a church after 1453, although temporarily when the Allies occupied Constantinople or Istanbul in 1918, after the conclusion of the First World War, the Allies had occupied the city of Istanbul for some time. And during this brief occupation, the Allies wanted to reconvert Hagia Sophia into a church, and there were discussions taking place between allies from different affiliations or different belonging to different denominations. Of course, the French and the Italians wanted the Catholic Church to take hold of Hagia Sophia because of its symbolic importance. On the other hand, we had the Protestants, the British Protestants. They wanted to take a side, and there was this dispute going on between the allies as to which particular denomination will now control Hagia Sophia. It didn't last for long because the Turks were able to take the land back. They were able to free Constantinople, and then Mustafa Kemal Ataturk decided that the building will turn into a museum. And since then, it had been a museum. Now, after over, let's say, 70 years, or maybe more than that, nearly 80 years or 90 years, because in the 1930s, it was in the 1930s when the building was officially turned into a museum. So now it has been turned into a mosque for the Muslims of the city. So what's the big deal about it? I don't know what the fuss is about. It was acquired by conquest, and all civilizations have done that in the past. Every single civilization, you name it, all of them, when they acquired territory by conquest, they occupied everything. They occupied places of worship, they occupied buildings, they occupied cattle, they occupied fields, they occupied, you name it. The British Empire occupied lands, and from these lands, the British Empire accumulated so much treasures, so many treasures and wealth that you can see it today in the British Museum when they ruled India, because India was the majority of the people were Hindus and Muslims. The Muslims were the second largest majority or minority, you can say. It was the largest minority and second largest majority in India. So the British didn't see it beneficial for their interest to convert places of worship into churches. There were churches built in India. There are churches there to this day. But in other places, for example, if you look at other examples, in Spain, all mosques of the Muslims were converted. Almost every single mosque was converted into a church, including the major mosque of Cordoba, the Mosque of Cordoba. And the fact that Muslims are able to build mosques in Western countries has no bearing on the historic value of Hagia Sophia as a place of worship, because it was a church. It was lost to the Turks through conquest, and then it was turned into a mosque. It remained a mosque for 4 centuries, and no one batted an eyelid. And then the Turks themselves decided, whether all Turks decided this or not, I can assure you that majority of the practicing Muslim Turks, who were the majority in Turkey, even as late as the early 20th century, did not agree with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and his actions there. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was a dictator, and he decided, due to the fact that he himself was a secularist, he decided that he will convert the building into a museum. Now, that doesn't mean that all the Turks who were practicing Muslims at the time, who actually did believe in Islam, we don't know whether Mustafa Kemal Ataturk actually believed in Islam as we know it today, because he tried to de-Islamify Turkey, and he did it openly. He did it overtly. You know, he made it very clear that he wants to de-Islamify Turkey by banning the adhan, or maybe making the adhan into Turkish. I don't think Ataturk was threatened by Britain, and that's why he made all the changes. I think Ataturk himself lacked belief in Orthodox Islam. I don't know whether he was a Muslim, he believed in Islam, or he died a Muslim, I don't know. But he lacked, at least we know that for a fact, that he lacked belief in what we know today as Orthodox Islam. Okay, and I don't think he did what he did due to the British pressure, okay, or the Allied pressure. Okay, so the fact that Muslims are free to build churches, they are doing it through the legal procedure in these countries. There are churches that are gone empty. Christians do not pray in them anymore. A majority of the churches are empty in places like Britain, where I live today, and these buildings are abandoned. So what the councils do? They sell these churches to anyone. Anyone can come. I've seen churches converted into flats. There's a church there is a church not very far from me. That church was bought by investors. They renovated the church and they made flats, and they are renting these flats out. So churches are being used for a number of different purposes in Britain. I can remember a church was used as a nightclub. Okay, I can remember that in the 90s. I came to know that there was a church that was actually being used as a nightclub in central London, and that church is on Shaftesbury. It's on Shaftesbury Avenue in central London. So there are many examples we can give. It so happens that when Muslims claim a right which belongs to them, everyone starts to make noise. For example, I was watching news, and there was a statement from UNESCO that they will reconsider the status of the building as a World Heritage Site. I don't know whether this particular approach or attitude was the same in the case of Babri Masjid, when Babri Masjid in India was demolished, and now the Indian Supreme Court has actually decided or issued a decree that a Hindu temple, can be built at the place of this mosque. The mosque is still standing. It hasn't been demolished. So I don't know whether UNESCO is uniform or whether it is consistent in its behavior or in its approach or reaction to similar incidents happening around the world. And by the way, the case of Babri Mosque is very different to what happened in the case of Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia belongs to the Turks. The Turks have owned it for the last 500 years, nearly 500 years, and it was a mosque for over 400 years. And the Turks, or one of the leaders, decided to convert it into a museum against the wishes of the people. And now the people have democratically, legally got their right back. They want it to be a mosque, and mosque it is now. He acquired the city by conquest. He acquired the city by conquest, and he didn't want to destroy Constantinople. He wanted to acquire the city through treaty. Okay, he gave plenty of chances to the Byzantine leadership at the time to have a treaty with him, sign some sort of agreement whereby he can occupy the city and the Christians can keep the places of worship and all that, because by treaty, according to the Islamic system or Islamic view, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih and his ulama followed, was that if the city is taken by treaty, then everything belongs to whoever is in ownership of it, right? But this question, whether he actually bought it or not, cannot be ascertained. I haven't seen any robust evidence so far. There are images circulating online of this particular agreement, which is like an old manuscript. I've seen images, and the images are not clear, so I haven't had the chance to actually study that particular document. I don't know how authentic it is. Only Turkish scholars can comment on that. Only international scholars, for that matter, Western scholars, can look at it and ascertain its authenticity. But my point is that as a conqueror, someone who conquered the city by force, using the largest guns ever produced in the history of humanity, he had to bombard the walls of Constantinople for nearly 2 months before he could take the city. And he had plenty of time to negotiate terms with the Byzantines and vice versa. But such terms could not come about, unfortunately. Such agreements couldn't take place. In fact, there is this very important history I recommend for everyone to study. Generally, it's a good history of the Ottoman Empire. It is titled Osman's Dream, and the author is Caroline Finkel. It is a tour de force through the Ottoman history, a very highly recommended book. On page 54, she actually talks about the taking of the city of Constantinople. She does not mention anything about the Sultan buying the church from the Byzantines or the Christians. She simply states that the church was converted into a mosque, and the Sultan was absolutely fascinated by the structure, and he was completely taken away. For example, I can read the actual part. It's on page 52, Osman's Dream by Caroline Finkel. She states, and I quote, "The first Friday prayer after the conquest, conducted by Sheikh Akshamsuddin, took place in the Basilica of Hagia Sophia, Emperor Justinian's imperial church, which had been turned into a mosque. Sultan Mehmed purportedly first walked into Hagia Sophia in the company of Tursun Bey, who saw and recorded the awe and wonder inspired in him by the interior. Transformation of the Christian Byzantine church into an Islamic Ottoman mosque required only the removal of the paraphernalia of Christian ritual, i.e. crosses and bells, and their replacement with the furniture of Muslim worship, i.e. a prayer niche, a pulpit, and minarets. Later, Mehmed also added a theological college to the complex. The Sultan's banners carried at the siege were displayed to commemorate his great victory, while prayer carpets supposedly belonging to the Prophet Muhammad redefined the religious character of the church." And it goes on. So basically, she doesn't mention anything about buying the church from the Christians. And I think I have my doubts about the story. But even if it's true, it doesn't change the fact that the city was taken by conquest. It was taken by force. The Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, by the common conventions of the time, had complete right to occupy it and do what he wants with it. And The fact that he converted the building into a mosque goes to show that he had maximum respect and a sense of awe towards the building, and he made it a symbol of his victory. He made it a symbol of Islam. He made it a monument to the victory of Islam, for that matter, in that region. So this is what his view was. Also, another book I was looking into. I haven't looked into this book too much, but I couldn't find anything significant on Hagia Sophia in the book. But it is a good read on Sultan Muhammad the Conqueror and his times. Yeah, it's published by Princeton University Press. It's by Franz Babinger. So this is what I have to say on the question whether it was actually bought or not. Look, there are other examples in the history of Islam, fascinating examples, where cities were taken by treaty, and at times half the city was taken by treaty and the other half was taken by force. Damascus is a very good question. If you go to the early histories of Islam, when the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, were conquering lands around Arabia, and that also included the land of Levant, when they went to the city of Damascus, they conquered the city by force from one side, and the other side actually capitulated. What are the details? The details are far too many for me to give in this short discussion. You can study Imam al-Baladuri's Futuh al-Buldan, or the conquest of lands. In that book, he gives some details about the conquest of Damascus in particular. So what happened? Khalid bin Walid, a general of the army of Islam, who was a companion of the Prophet of Islam, he besieged the city from one side. If I'm not mistaken, he was on the eastern side. The western side was also besieged by Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah. And cut the long story short, without giving too many details, Khalid bin Walid had struck a treaty. There was a bishop on the wall who was communicating with Khalid bin Walid that if we surrender, will you consider the city taken by treaty, or will it be considered taken by force? So Khalid clarified that taken by treaty means you keep your places of worship, you keep your property, and you simply pay jizya and you live in peace, right? You pay the jizya tax and you live in peace. On the other hand, Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah, while this discussion was taking place, had breached the wall or the door of his side, and he had already come into the city, conquering it by force. Now, when the bishop saw what was happening on the other side, he quickly, quite cleverly, struck a deal with Khalid bin Walid, and he opened the door by treaty. The Arabic terms are sulhan. Sulhan means by treaty, by agreement, right? Mutual agreement of peace, basically. And the term for taken by force is anwatan. Anwatan means by force. So Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah had entered the city anwatan, which is by force, and Khalid bin Walid entered the city by treaty because the gates were opened for him from that side. So both leaders met in the middle of the city of Damascus. Now there was confusion. How do we treat the city? Is it taken by force, or is it taken by sulh, by agreement? So it was decided. This is how fair the Muslims are. Subhanallah. The early Muslims, they were epitome of justice and keeping their word. They kept their word with the Christians. They could have easily turned around and said, sorry guys, the city was taken by force from that side, therefore we will treat the city. Absolutely. And they fulfilled it. Khalid said, no, I have entered by treaty. I have entered by treaty. So this side cannot be treated as if it was taken by force, because taken by force means a completely different thing. That means everything belongs to you. All the property, all the buildings, everything belongs to you. So in the case of Damascus, a very interesting incident took place. Now, there was a big church in the middle of Damascus, the Church of St. John, which is today known as Al-Jama Al-Umawi, okay? The Umayyad Mosque. I don't know if you know much about it. I have seen it in person. I happened to visit Syria before the current crisis. I loved the city of Damascus. I went as a tourist, and it was absolutely amazing. I saw the Umayyad Mosque with my own eyes. I could see the Greek language written on the walls of the mosque. And that Greek text is from the period when that particular building belonged to the Romans, and it was a temple of Jupiter. This is something you have to understand now, how civilizations worked in the past. It was the temple of Jupiter in the city of Damascus, the oldest inhabited city in the world today, as some scholars believe, right? So it was a temple of Jupiter. So after the Christians overpowered the land of Damascus, or the land of Syria, okay, they turned the temple of Jupiter, once the Romans disappeared from the scene, once and for all, the Christians converted the building into the Church of St. John, okay? So a Roman temple, a pagan temple, was converted into a church. Now, when the city of Damascus was lost, half of it by treaty and half of it by force, the question arose, how do we deal with this particular church? Is it taken by force? Is it taken by treaty? Now, because of that confusion in the beginning, or because of that dispute in the beginning between Khalid bin Walid and Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah, okay, it was decided that by that virtue, half the city was taken by sulh agreement and the other half was taken by force. By that virtue, the church will be split into two. One half will be used by the Christians, the other half will be used by the Muslims. So this is how it was decided that the Christians and the Muslims will worship together in the same building in separate sections, worshiping God in their own ways. And later on, there is longer history to explain of this particular building. Later on, one of the Umayyad caliphs, he tried to change that status. Walid bin Abdul Malik, he tried to change the status of the building to take it completely for Muslims because of the growth of population. And later, and he had done that. There was still a considerable Christian population in Damascus as late as the Middle Ages. We're talking about the time of Crusades. The population of Damascus had grown, and Walid bin Abdul Malik, he wanted the building for the Muslims only, and the Christians weren't happy with that. So later on, after the death of Walid bin Abdul Malik, Sulaiman bin Abdul Malik came to power, and he was succeeded by Umar bin Abdul Aziz, the pious caliph who only governed for 2 years. Christians, having known him, they knew that he's a great person, he's a just person, he will do justice with our cause. They went to him complaining that Walid had taken their half by force against their wish for the Muslims. So Umar bin Abdul Aziz was very disturbed by this. So he offered the Christians two options: that you can have your half back, which is going to be problematic. Now that the Muslims have started to use the other half, it will be very difficult to take away a space they have used as mosque from them. So I have two options. We can do that and take that half for you, or you can take all the churches of Ghouta. Ghouta is a region in Syria close to Damascus, and all those churches were taken by force. By that virtue, they belonged to the Muslims. They were under Muslim possession. So he said, you can take all of them back as churches, just leave this half for the Muslims. And the Christians happily agreed. They could not believe the option that was given to them. So they took all the churches of Ghouta for themselves and left the other half for the Muslims. And they belong to the Christians to this day. Those churches of Ghouta, they belong to the Christians to this day. The land of Palestine was occupied by cunning, by deception, by force in the sense that the people of Palestine were wrongfully driven off their land. The people were massacred. There was no conflict between two armies as such. In the 1940s, I'm talking about when Balfour Declaration took place. Firstly, Balfour Declaration happened earlier, of course, when the British mandate was established over Palestine, and the British government, against the wishes of the people of Palestine, gave the land of Palestine to the Zionists at the time. Okay, so firstly, the whole thing was illegal. The way it was done was completely illegal. There was no war as such right? Of course, I know General Allenby entered Palestine by force. I know that, okay? But that doesn't give the British a right, because they never consulted Palestinians. Palestinians were a party to the place of worship we are talking about. For example, this is a joint place of worship for three religions, right? It belongs to the Christians, okay? The Holy Sepulchre, the Church of Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon or Masjid al-Aqsa or the Dome of the Rock complex belongs to the Muslims as well as the Jewish people. Historically speaking, the Jews were allowed to worship in that temple, the Wailing Wall and that site. The Muslims have worshipped in this place for centuries. The Christians have been there from time immemorial. And when we go back in history, the site was always shared by three religions. This is why the state of Israel never fully occupied the complex. The complex was never taken by force. And in fact, the management of the complex still belongs to the Jordanian government. The state of Israel, I am stating this again with responsibility, have, to my knowledge, never claimed direct ownership or the possession of the complex of Al-Haram al-Sharif, okay, which is the holy site, the mosque, Masjid Umar, and the Dome of the Rock. They have never directly claimed ownership or the possession of the complex, because to this day, the complex remains in the hands of the Jordanian government. The Jordanian government continues to manage the complex. Even if you walk into the mosque today, the masahif, the Qur'ans have been published and printed in Jordan. You will not find the Saudi Qur'ans in there. Saudi Arabia has management of two holy sites of Islam, Medina and Mecca, while Jordan takes care of the third holy site, which is the city of Jerusalem, or the mosque complex in Jerusalem. And this is because after the 1967 war, when Israel occupied the city of Jerusalem, the management of the complex was never directly handed over to the Israelis, to my knowledge. The history of the Al-Aqsa complex is completely different to what happened in Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia case is the city of Constantinople entirely was taken by force as a conquest, while the state of Israel never did that in the city of Jerusalem. Even the city of Jerusalem, the status is still controversial. There are so many United Nations resolutions against what Israel is doing in Palestine. So all of that needs to be considered. And if the city of Jerusalem falls, or if the complex of Masjid al-Aqsa is demolished, then of course the Israeli government has the Muslim population of Palestine to face, and the global reaction from the Muslim world is also there, which the state of Israel has been very careful about. So it's a very different situation. The history of Palestine and the city of Jerusalem and the history of Al-Aqsa complex, Masjid al-Aqsa, is very different to what's happening. Unless, to make the final point, unless the state of Israel completely occupies Al-Aqsa complex and drives all the Muslims out, tells them no more prayer, no more Jummahs, no more Eid, nothing, and completely shuts down the complex and starts demolishing it and builds a temple in its place, then of course it's a different story altogether. But that's never happened. The state of Israel has never done that. And the reason is consequences, because the Zionist state of Israel is worried about the consequences. What will be the consequence? There are Israeli intellectuals who talked about extremists who went into Al-Aqsa Mosque and sprayed people or when they have attacked. There was in the 1960s when someone tried to burn down the mosque, and the member of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was burnt, unfortunately. There was another incident when an extremist, a Jewish extremist, walked into a mosque in Hebron, if I'm not mistaken, in Masjid Ibrahim al-Khalil. He sprayed down with bullets a lot of Muslims, innocent Muslims, praying. So a lot of these extremists want Al-Aqsa Mosque to be occupied and conquered and completely demolished or something. And some of the Israeli intellectuals have been saying that this will cause a commotion between the Zionist state of Israel and the rest of the Muslim world. And this is one of the consequences Israeli intellectuals have been talking about. So there is no comparison between what's happening in Turkey and Hagia Sophia, which had been a mosque for over 400 years. It was a mosque. It was converted into a mosque. And then Turks, or one of their leaders, decided to turn it into a museum. It never went back to a church. Although, as I said earlier, that the Allied forces, when they occupied Istanbul temporarily, tried to convert it back to a church, but they couldn't successfully do it. It was never converted back to a mosque. And as far as the Muslims of Turkey are concerned, it is still a mosque. Whether it was, even when it was a museum, to them, to the Turkish Muslims, it was a mosque that was converted into a museum. It was not a church when it was made into a museum. It was a mosque, and it has come back to a mosque. It was a mosque that was forcefully converted by a secularist into a museum, and that secularist dictator called Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had no right to convert a mosque used by thousands or possibly hundreds of thousands of Turkish Muslims for prayer into a museum. So he had no right to do so. He did it as a dictatorial measure, which has been rightly reversed, which has been rightly reversed by the current government of Turkey. In fact, if anything, the current government of Turkey must be applauded for this action, for returning a mosque to its rightful place. I'm telling you as a Muslim, Christians, Jews, non-believers, anyone is always welcome to walk into a mosque and sit there, watch Muslims pray, talk to Muslims, go around and look at the basilica. It is, I mean, I look, I believe it is now more available to masses than it was before. It was very expensive to enter that particular building, by the way. A lot of people are not looking at the practical side of this conversion. I'm pretty sure the Turkish government will allow this to happen, that they must allow all non-Muslims to walk in and look at the basilica and see how the Muslims pray and talk to Muslims, and Muslims can give them a tour. And I really invite the Turkish Muslims in particular to study the history of the basilica, okay? Preserve all the historical items therein, and anything that's offensive to Islam shouldn't be, I believe it shouldn't be destroyed. It should be simply covered up, so that it's not destroyed. It remains there for scholars to study and learn from it, right? And nothing should be touched. I believe nothing should be demolished, nothing should be destroyed, nothing should be altered when it comes to the structure of the building and whatever it contains, because it is still a joint, how can I put it, a common human heritage. It belongs to all of us. It belongs to Christians, it belongs to the Jews, it belongs to the Muslims, it belongs to humans.